A man stands in a long, curved studio in a village in Normandy, peering at a canvas he can barely see, dragging a brush loaded with pale violet paint across a surface already crowded with colour. He's in his early 80s. His eyes are failing him. The cataracts have advanced far enough that the colours he mixes are approximate, the shapes he chases half-remembered. The light he has spent his entire life studying, now arriving to him, distorted and dimmed. And still he paints. This is a man who organised every decade of his existence around the act of seeing, who moved his household to be near particular water, who built an entire garden so he could study how light moved across its surface, who rented rooms across from cathedral facades and sat there through 2 winters watching stone change colour by the hour. Now the light is leaving him. The central fact of his life is being taken away, and he is still standing at the canvas. His name is Claude Monet. The year is somewhere in the early 1920s, and almost nothing about this moment looks like triumph. The studio around him is vast. The curved walls lined with enormous canvases, panels so large they dwarf the man working on them. Outside, the garden he designed and obsessed over for 30 years is still there, the pond with its Japanese bridge. He planted all of it, and now he can barely see it clearly enough to know whether what he's putting on the canvas bears any relationship to what's actually there. This is the painter who gave the world Impressionism, the man whose work hangs in every major museum, whose water lily panels fill 2 oval rooms in Paris. But that version of his life, the celebrated master, the visionary, the founder of a movement, arrived very late, and only after decades of grinding failure. He was poor for most of his adult life. His most ambitious early paintings were rejected. He attempted to drown himself in the Seine. He buried a wife. He watched his own visions slowly collapse. It was not inevitable. It took 40 years of losing before anything resembling winning arrived. How does someone survive that? How does a man who failed by almost every conventional measure for the first half of his life end up changing how the entire world looks at light? This is the story of how a seaside caricaturist who attempted suicide in his 20s became the painter who changed everything. He was born on November 14th, 1840, on the 5th floor of a building on the Rue Lafitte in Paris, the second son of a shipping merchant who expected his children to be useful. His full name at baptism was Oscar Claude Monet. The ceremony took place on May 20th, 1841, at Notre Dame de Lorette, the parish church a few blocks from the family's apartment. His father, Claude Adolphe, ran operations in the family's shipping concern. His mother, Louise Justine Aubray Monet, had a quieter sensibility, an inclination toward the artistic that her husband neither shared nor particularly encouraged. The household sat squarely in the commercial middle class, where ambition meant ledgers and cargo manifests, not brushes. This was the world the boy named Oscar was born into. For the first few years of his life, Paris was its entire frame. Then in 1845, when Monet was 5 years old, the family left. Claude Adolphe had been offered a position with his brother-in-law's grocery business in Le Havre, a port city on the Normandy coast, where the Seine empties into the English Channel. It was not a glamorous opportunity. Le Havre was a working city, docks and warehouses, and the constant industrial churn of a harbour that loaded and unloaded cargo from across the Atlantic. But the family went. The move would prove to be one of the determining facts of Monet's entire life. He was 5. He would spend the next 20 years in a city that was essentially one long encounter with changing light on moving water. Consider what Le Havre actually was. The English Channel produces weather at a pace that seems almost argumentative. Fog rolling in, burning off, returning by afternoon, clouds dragging their shadows across the water at speeds you can track with your eye. The harbour itself was a theatre of atmosphere, ships coming and going, the water shifting colour by the hour, the sky above the channel doing something different every time you looked at it. For a child inclined toward watching, and Monet was, from his earliest years, a child who watched, this was not a backdrop. It was an education. He despised formal schooling. He said so himself years later, without softening it. "School was always like a prison to me," he told an interviewer. He could never bring himself to stay there, even 4 hours a day. The teachers at his Le Havre lycée would not have recognized the man he became. He was not a promising student in any conventional sense. He sat at the back of classrooms and filled the margins of his notebooks with sketches, teachers, classmates, faces observed with the quick satirical precision of someone who sees exactly what is in front of him and cannot resist recording it. The discipline of formal instruction had almost no hold on him. The discipline of looking, the patient, sustained attention to how a thing actually appeared, that came naturally and early. What school could not give him, the coast around Le Havre provided in abundance. He spent his time outdoors along the beaches and the cliffs, watching the water and the sky go through their daily arguments. The Normandy coastline is not dramatic in the way that mountain landscapes are dramatic. Its power is subtler and more insistent. The perpetual motion of the channel, the way the light behaves differently at 8 in the morning than it does at 3 in the afternoon. The precise quality of overcast coastal grey that is nothing like the grey of a city sky. Monet absorbed all of this before he had any theoretical framework for understanding what he was absorbing. It became the deep grammar of his visual thinking, the set of instincts he would spend the rest of his life articulating on canvas. His mother saw something in him. Louise Justine never had the resources or the influence to do much about what she saw, but she was not indifferent to it. Her encouragement in those early years mattered in ways that became clearer only later. Then in January 1857 she died. Monet was 16 years old. The loss was immediate and its consequences were practical. His father had no patience for the drawing and the outdoor wandering. Claude Adolphe Monet was not a cruel man, but he was a businessman. He needed his son to become a useful member of the enterprise he had spent his life building. Painting was not useful. Sketching caricatures of local merchants in the margins of schoolbooks was not useful. The family's position in Le Havre's commercial world required the kind of sustained practical effort that a boy with a sketchbook showed no signs of providing. The two of them, father and son, occupied the same house in a state of sustained disagreement about what the boy's future was supposed to look like. What saved Monet from a complete submission to his father's expectations was his father's sister-in-law, Marie-Jeanne Lecadre. She was a wealthy widow with no children of her own. She had something else as well. She painted. Not professionally, not seriously by the standards of the Paris art world, but genuinely and with enough feeling for it that she recognized the same feeling in her nephew. When his mother died, Monet moved into her household. The financial circumstances alone were a relief. She could provide stability that his father's operations, respectable as they were, could not guarantee in the same form. But the more consequential thing she provided was permission. She did not tell him to stop painting. She told him, in the practical way of someone who understood what it cost to go against a family's expectations, that his talent was real and deserved to be taken seriously. His father disapproved, his mother was dead. The only person in his family willing to take his painting seriously was an aunt who painted watercolours in her spare time, which was, as it turned out, just enough. The first time anyone paid him for his art, Monet was 15 years old and producing caricatures of local businessmen and civic figures that were sharp enough and funny enough to sell themselves. The faces he drew were recognisable, sometimes uncomfortably so, and the people of Le Havre found them amusing enough to part with real money. 10 francs for a likeness, 20 if the subject was prominent enough to warrant the premium. Monet later recalled that within a month his clientele had doubled. He was good at reading faces. He understood which features to exaggerate, how much distortion a subject could absorb before amusement curdled into offence. These were not the skills of a child dabbling at art. They were the skills of someone who had been watching people very carefully for a long time. The frame shop where his caricatures were displayed was run by a man named Gravier. It occupied a modest but well-trafficked position in Le Havre. Gravier was happy to exhibit the young Monet's work. It drew customers, and customers spent money. But Gravier also used his window to show paintings by working artists. One of those artists was a landscape painter named Eugène Boudin. Where Monet's caricatures were clever and immediate, Boudin's paintings were something else entirely. They were small, often, and loosely handled, depicting the beaches and harbours and vast cloud-filled skies of Normandy. Boudin was not famous. He was known in regional circles, respected by a small number of serious painters, largely ignored by the academic establishment in Paris. None of that mattered to what was about to happen. Boudin saw Monet's caricatures in Gravier's shop and sought the young man out. The meeting that followed was not, by Monet's own later account, immediately transformative. He was, by his own admission, somewhat pleased with himself at the time. He was earning money. He had a clientele. He had the confidence of someone who has discovered, young, that he possesses a genuine skill and that other people will pay for it. Boudin was 40 years old, a painter who worked outdoors in all weathers. His invitation to the 15-year-old caricaturist to come and paint outside with him was not obviously appealing. Monet resisted. He found Boudin's work uncertain in ways he could not quite articulate. The looseness, the apparent incompleteness, the refusal to render things with the kind of clean descriptive clarity that his caricatures prized. But Boudin persisted, and eventually Monet went. What happened on that Norman beach sometime in the mid-1850s is one of the most consequential moments in the history of Western art, which is not a claim that would have seemed remotely plausible at the time. Two painters, one young and sceptical, one older and deeply committed to his practice, set up before an open sky. Boudin showed Monet how he worked. He painted what was in front of him. The light as it existed at that hour, in that weather, on that particular stretch of coast. He did not sketch and return to a studio to construct a finished composition from memory. He responded directly to what he saw. He accepted that the painting made under those conditions carried something real in it, something that no amount of studio refinement could restore once the moment had passed. Consider what this meant against the background of how painting was actually taught and practiced in the 1850s. Academic training was built on a set of assumptions so deeply embedded that most painters never questioned them. You studied anatomy, perspective, the drawing of the human figure. You worked from plaster casts and then from live models in controlled studio light. You learned the great historical subjects, mythology, religious narrative, scenes from ancient history. A finished painting was finished in a specific sense. Its surfaces were smooth, its forms were clearly defined, its colours were mixed and harmonised according to established principles. Painting outdoors in changing weather, on a coastline where the light might transform completely in an hour, was understood not as a serious practice but as a preparatory exercise at best. You might make outdoor sketches to gather reference material. You would never mistake such a sketch for the painting itself. Boudin rejected this hierarchy entirely. He believed the sketch made in front of the motif contained something irreplaceable. He believed that the marks made in response to actual light were different in kind from marks made in a studio, regardless of how carefully one worked from memory or preliminary studies. He was not arguing for roughness or incompleteness as virtues in themselves. He was arguing that what the eye actually sees, in the full complexity of atmospheric conditions, the haze over the water, the way clouds alter the colour of sand, the difference between morning light and afternoon light on the same white boat hull, was the painter's true subject. That no studio reconstruction, however skillful, could fully recover it. Monet absorbed this, not immediately. He was 15. The ideas were large, but he absorbed it in the deep way that formative experiences work, settling into the structure of how a person thinks rather than remaining on the surface as an intellectual position. He later said that Boudin opened his eyes and the phrasing is precise. It was not that Boudin taught him technique, though technique was part of it. It was that Boudin showed him where to look and what to look for. That once you had seen the light on a Norman beach as Boudin saw it, the conventions of academic painting began to look like an elaborate agreement to ignore the most interesting thing happening in any scene. Boudin's influence did not redirect Monet away from ambition. The caricatures had already demonstrated that he was capable of sustained work, technical development, commercial success. What changed was the object of that ambition. There was still the same sharp attention to what was actually in front of him, the same quality of observation that had made his drawn faces legible and funny. But now that attention had a different direction entirely. Outdoors, the subject was not a face to be read and exaggerated, but a sky to be watched, water to be studied, light to be followed as it moved and shifted and rendered the same cliff face 3 entirely different colours in the space of a single afternoon. He was 15 and then 16, and his mother was dead, and his father wanted him in business. But he had stood on a Norman beach with Eugène Boudin and watched the light change. The question of what he was going to do with his life had effectively been settled. Whether or not anyone around him understood that yet, Boudin had shown him something that could not be unseen. That light was not a backdrop to painting, but its actual subject, that the only way to truly capture it was to stand in front of it while it was happening. Paris in 1859 was not particularly interested in young painters who wanted to paint sky and water instead of mythology and history, but Monet went anyway. He was 18 years old, equipped with whatever confidence Boudin had given him, and very little else. His father had agreed to a trial arrangement. Monet would go to Paris, assess his prospects, and report back. The city he arrived in was in the middle of being demolished and rebuilt. Baron Haussmann's reconstruction program had been tearing up medieval Paris for nearly a decade, driving long, straight boulevards through ancient neighbourhoods, replacing narrow, crooked streets with the wide, ceremonial avenues the Second Empire demanded. Scaffolding rose on every block, dust hung in the air. Paris was becoming modern, whether its residents wanted it to or not. The painters who would eventually document that modernity were just beginning to arrive. Monet did not enroll in the École des Beaux-Arts. The most prestigious art school in France had entrance examinations, rigid instruction, a curriculum designed to produce painters capable of depicting historical scenes on enormous canvases in the approved academic manner. Its teachers expected students to spend years copying old masters before attempting original work. Everything about it ran contrary to what Boudin had shown him. Instead, Monet found his way to the Académie Suisse, a modest studio on the Ile de la Cité that operated on a different principle entirely. There were no examinations, no fixed curriculum, no master lecturing students on the correct way to render drapery. Artists paid a small fee, live models were provided, and students worked. It was informal, almost to the point of chaos. For Monet, it was exactly right. It was at the Académie Suisse that he first encountered Camille Pissarro. Pissarro was 10 years older, born in the Danish West Indies, serious in a way that Monet, who was still partly a caricaturist at heart, was only beginning to become. He was already committed to landscape painting, already sceptical of academic conventions, already thinking about light and atmosphere in ways that aligned closely with what Boudin had been teaching on the beaches of Normandy. The two men recognized something in each other. Their friendship would survive decades of poverty, disagreement, the 1,000 small betrayals that artistic movements produce. Pissarro would eventually become one of the few people whose technical judgment Monet genuinely respected. But Paris tested him. Money ran short almost immediately. His father, who had granted permission for this experiment with visible reluctance, was not generous. Monet wrote letters home explaining that he needed more time, more funds, that he was making progress. The letters were not always persuasive. He was living cheaply, eating poorly, learning what it meant to be an artist in a city that had hundreds of them and no particular need for more. He kept working. Then in 1862, Monet entered the studio of Charles Gleyre, an academic history painter of Swiss origin who had taken over the studio from Paul Delaroche. Gleyre's reputation was conventional, his instruction classical. He believed in careful drawing, in historical subjects, in the kind of finish that salon juries rewarded, smooth surfaces, invisible brushwork, scenes from antiquity rendered with painstaking detail. He was not, on his face, the right teacher for a young man who had been converted to outdoor painting by a Norman beach artist who specialised in cloud formations. And yet Gleyre's studio was where everything changed. Pierre-Auguste Renoir was there, Frédéric Bazille was there, Alfred Sisley was there. Within months of Monet's arrival, this group had formed around a shared conviction that what they were being taught was not wrong exactly, but insufficient. They learned from Gleyre. They absorbed his lessons about drawing, composition, the structural foundations that their later work would quietly depend on. But in the evenings, in the cafes along the Boulevard Montmartre, they argued about what painting was actually for. Academic painting had answers to this question. It was for the elevation of the viewer, the commemoration of history, the illustration of moral and classical themes. Its hierarchy of subjects was formal and settled, history painting at the top, portraiture below it, landscape, and still life at the bottom. A painter who devoted himself to sky and water was declaring, in the terms the academic establishment understood, that he was content with the least serious work available to him. Monet and his circle rejected this entirely. They were not interested in mythology. They were not interested in scenes from Roman history. What interested them was the world they could see from any window, the river, the streets, the light on the side of a building at 4 p.m. Was that less serious? They didn't think so. Consider what Paris looked like in those years. Haussmann's new boulevards were filling with people, carriages and gaslight. The café culture that Haussmann's wide pavements made possible was inventing a new form of public life. The trains running into the new Gare Saint-Lazare were bringing day trippers out to the countryside and depositing them back in the city by evening. The modern world, immediate and alive, and changing hour by hour, was right outside the studio door. These were the painters who would eventually capture it. The salon, however, was not yet convinced. The annual exhibition at the Palais de l'Industrie was the only venue that genuinely mattered. A painting accepted by the salon reached tens of thousands of viewers and could establish or destroy a reputation in a single season. Its juries were dominated by Académie des Beaux-Arts members who judged work against academic standards of finish, subject and technique. Monet submitted for the first time in 1865. The jury accepted 2 of his seascape paintings, coastal scenes of the Normandy shore. Careful enough in their execution to pass muster. It was a genuine success. Critics noticed them. His name appeared in print for the first time. He was 24 years old, and it felt briefly as though the system might accommodate him after all. The feeling did not last. The larger and more ambitious he painted, the less patience the juries had. Women in the Garden, a monumental canvas depicting figures in an outdoor setting that Monet had painted entirely in natural light, was rejected outright in 1867. The rejection was not surprising to anyone who understood what the salon valued. The painting's loose handling, its interest in the way sunlight actually falls across fabric and faces, its refusal to idealize, all of it was wrong by academic measure. Gleyre's technical lessons were visible in the canvas's structure. But what the painting was doing with that structure was something Gleyre himself would not have recognized as legitimate. Monet painted it anyway. That was what the circle around him was becoming, a group of painters who understood the rules they were breaking, who had been trained well enough to break them deliberately. Renoir and Basile and Sisley were all working through the same contradictions, all running up against the same institutional walls. The friendship held them together when the rejections came. He had his training, his friends, a set of ideas about painting that the salon would not accept, which meant the only question left was what he was going to do about it. In the spring of 1861, before he'd had a single major success, and before anyone outside a small circle of painters had any idea who he was, the French army conscripted Claude Monet into a light cavalry unit bound for North Africa. He was 20 years old. The Chasseurs d'Afrique were a light cavalry regiment, fast-moving, built for the open terrain of Algeria that France had been occupying since 1830. Monet had no particular enthusiasm for military service, and no particular talent for it either. He was a painter who had only recently begun to understand what painting actually required. The army had other plans for him. Algeria was nothing like Normandy. It was nothing like Paris. The light there operated according to entirely different principles, harder, more direct, stripped of the soft atmospheric moisture that gave the Norman coast its particular quality. In Le Havre, the sky and the sea were in constant negotiation, light filtering through cloud and fog, colour shifting by the hour. In Algeria, the sun was sovereign. It flattened shadows, bleached stone, turned the landscape into something almost abstract in its intensity. Monet had no adequate framework for what he was looking at. The painters he admired, the techniques Boudin had introduced him to, the lessons half absorbed in the studios of Paris, none of it had prepared him for this quality of illumination. He had no vocabulary for it yet. What he had instead was the thing Boudin had given him, the habit of looking. He painted almost nothing. One landscape survived his service, then it didn't. The record suggests it was lost or destroyed at some point after his return. A handful of sketches, some military portraits, none of it significant. The conditions weren't right for the kind of painting he cared about. A cavalry regiment in active service does not pause to let its soldiers study the effect of midday light on red rock. Monet was a soldier first, and somewhere much further down the list, an artist. The work he managed to do was preliminary, provisional, the visual equivalent of notes taken in poor light. Then he got sick. Typhoid moved through military encampments, the way it always did, quietly at first, then with devastating speed. Monet contracted it during his service, and it was serious enough to threaten everything. He was young, and had not yet done anything that would justify his confidence in himself. There is something clarifying about a fever that brings you genuinely close to dying. You either emerge from it more committed to whatever you had been doing before, or you don't emerge at all. Monet emerged. His aunt Marie-Jeanne Lecadre had been watching from France with mounting concern. She was not a passive figure in his life. She was a woman of means, of practical intelligence, of genuine artistic sympathy, an amateur painter herself, willing to take seriously what his father dismissed as impractical. When word reached her that her nephew was ill in Algeria and likely to spend further years in military service that was destroying his health and consuming his most formative years as an artist, she acted. She negotiated directly with the military authorities. The terms by the standards of the time were straightforward. She would pay for Monet's early discharge. In exchange, he would commit to completing a course of formal artistic training. The army agreed, the transaction was completed, and Monet came home. Consider what this arrangement actually meant. His father had wanted him in the family business. His mother was dead. The one person in his family who understood what he was trying to do had now spent real money, not encouragement, not approval, but actual money to protect his ability to do it. Marie-Jeanne had made herself responsible for his future in a way that obligated him to take that future seriously. She wasn't rescuing a romantic young dreamer. She was investing in someone she believed was capable of something specific. She expected him to honour that belief. Within months of his return, Monet was back in Charles Gleyre's studio in Paris. working alongside Renoir and Sisley and Basile, fulfilling the terms of his aunt's arrangement and doing so, by all accounts, with renewed urgency. The year in Algeria had shaken something loose in him. He had been sick enough to understand that time was not unlimited. He had seen a quality of light that he could not paint, could not yet even properly describe. That incapacity bothered him in the particular way that artistic inadequacy bothers someone who already knows what standards they're holding themselves to. He returned to France, more certain than he had been before. Not certain about the Academy, not certain about the Salon and its juries and its definitions of what a finished painting was supposed to look like. Certain, specifically, about Boudin. About what Boudin had shown him on the beaches, outside Le Havre, when he was still a teenager, selling caricatures, and had not yet understood what he was actually capable of. The primacy of direct observation. The insistence that light itself was the subject. These were not local ideas, not provincial habits picked up from a minor Norman landscape painter. They were the right ideas. The Algerian sun had not contradicted them. It had amplified them. Demonstrated that the principle held across an entirely different atmosphere and geography. If the quality of light was this different, this transformative, this completely capable of making a familiar world unrecognizable, then the painter's entire task was to get in front of it, to look at it directly, to resist the studio and the sketch and the memory and the convention and stand in it while it was happening. His formal training resumed. The obligations to his aunt were met, but Monet was no longer working through uncertainty. He had a direction now. Hardened by illness and distance and a year of looking at light, he had no means to capture. He came back to France with no paintings worth keeping, 1 year of his life spent, a memory of Algerian light that would take decades to fully surface. Camille Dancieux was 19 when she started sitting for Monet. By 1866, her face was on the walls of the Salon, in a full-length portrait in a striped green dress that critics actually liked, which was more than could be said for almost anything else he submitted. The painting was called Camille, though it was also known as Woman in a Green Dress. It was something of an accident of ambition. Monet had been working on a far larger canvas, a vast outdoor composition called Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Figures in a forest clearing, an attempt to bring plein air painting to the scale that the Salon expected of serious work. He ran out of time and money before he could finish it. The Déjeuner was left behind with a landlord as collateral for unpaid rent and later damaged by damp. So Monet painted Camille instead, quickly, in 4 days by some accounts. She stands with her back half turned, her green and black striped dress trailing behind her, glancing over her shoulder. It is technically accomplished, direct, and alive in a way that academic portraits often were not. The Salon accepted it. Critics praised it. For a brief moment, it seemed like a door had opened. It had not opened, or rather, it had opened just far enough to show him what was on the other side, and then swung shut again. The year after the Camille portrait, Monet completed Women in the Garden, a canvas nearly 8 feet tall. 4 female figures in a sunlit garden, every one of them modelled by Camille. He had dug a trench in the earth outside to lower the canvas on a pulley system, so he could paint the upper sections without leaving the natural light. The ambition was extraordinary. The scale was extraordinary. The Salon jury rejected it without hesitation in 1867. The grounds were unstated, as they usually were, but the implication was clear enough. This was not serious painting. These were not serious subjects. A garden, some women, the play of sunlight through leaves, these were decorative concerns, not the stuff of art. The painting that Monet considered one of his most important achievements was Tueur. Ned away. With it went any realistic hope of the Salon recognition that still represented the primary route to commercial survival for a painter in France. What made this rejection different from the others was its timing. Camille was pregnant. Their son Jean was born in August of 1867. With the child came a level of financial pressure that moved well beyond the ordinary hardships of a struggling artist. Monet had been poor before. He had borrowed money from Basile, from his aunt, from anyone willing to help. He had gone without heat, without sufficient food, without the materials he needed. But that was the poverty of a young man with no obligations. This was something else. This was a child he could not feed, a woman he could not support, a father who refused to provide any assistance unless Monet abandoned Camille entirely. His father's position was not complicated. Camille Dancieux was not from the right family, was not the right kind of woman. The relationship had produced a child outside of marriage. The elder Monet would help his son, but not his son's family. Monet did not abandon Camille. He also could not support her. For the next year, they lived in conditions that were genuinely desperate, moving between addresses, managing on almost nothing. The situation periodically relieved by small infusions of cash from Basile or from whatever painting he could sell. Consider what this period actually looked like. A painter who had been working seriously for nearly a decade, who had produced work he believed in absolutely, who had the support of painters like Pissarro and Renoir and the theoretical backing of everything Boudin had taught him about light and direct observation, and none of it was enough. The world that was supposed to recognize his work had looked at it and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. In 1868, Monet walked to the Seine and tried to drown himself. He survived. The details of how are not fully recorded. What is known is that he went into the river and came back out. That this was not a gesture or a performance, but an act of genuine despair from a man who had reached the end of what he could endure. He was 27 years old. He had a son he could not provide for, and a partner who depended on him, and work he believed in that nobody was willing to buy. There is a tendency, in accounts of Monet's life, to move past this moment quickly, to acknowledge it briefly, and then return to the paintings, to the progressive unfolding of a great career. That is a mistake. The attempt was real. The despair behind it was real. It belongs in any honest account of who this man was and what it cost him to become what he became. He was not floating serenely above his circumstances, perfecting his vision in tranquil contemplation of light on water. He was drowning in the most literal sense he could arrange. What pulled him back was in part the arrival of a patron at almost exactly the right moment. Louis-Joachim Gaudibert was a wealthy merchant from Le Havre, the same port city where Monet had grown up, where Boudin had first taken him outdoors to paint. Gaudibert had seen Monet's work and believed in it. He commissioned a portrait of his wife, Madame Gaudibert. That Monet completed in 1868, a full-length painting of a woman in a yellow and brown dress. Her face turned slightly away, the composition echoing the Camille portrait in its directness and its refusal to flatter. Gaudibert paid him. More than that, Gaudibert provided ongoing support that gave Monet something he had not had in years, enough stability to actually work. The letters from this period show Monet in a state of something approaching relief, not prosperity, not comfort, but the absence of immediate catastrophe. Within months of this support, Monet was producing some of the strongest paintings he had yet made. The acute observation of light, the loosening of the brushwork, the willingness to let the conditions of the moment dictate the terms of the painting, all of it was still there, still pushing forward, even after everything the preceding years had cost him. He painted the river at Bougival. He painted his garden at Étretat. He painted Camille indoors and outdoors, in different light, at different hours. The work did not pause to recover from what he'd been through. It simply continued, which was perhaps the most revealing thing about it. Gaudibert's patronage did not solve the larger problem. The salon was still a gatekeeper Monet could not reliably pass through. His father was still withholding support. Camille and Jean were still living a precarious existence that depended on the continued goodwill of a merchant in Le Havre and the occasional sale through channels that were inconsistent at best. The pattern was already clear, even if Monet could not yet see where it was leading. He would produce ambitious work. The institutions would refuse it. The financial situation would become critical. Then, at the last possible moment, some form of support would appear. It was not a sustainable arrangement. It was barely an arrangement at all. But it was what he had. It was what kept him painting through years that would have stopped. Most people entirely. He had survived the river. He had a patron, and that was enough. Barely enough, but enough. When the Prussian armies crossed into France in the summer of 1870, Monet did what he would do every time his circumstances became truly intolerable. He left. He had married Camille Dancieux in June of that year. A quiet civil ceremony that formalised what had already been true for years. They had a son, Jean, who was 3 years old. The marriage brought no financial relief. The salon continued to be indifferent. The money was scarce, and now there was a war. Monet had served once already, in Algeria, and he had no intention of serving again. So in the autumn of 1870, he crossed the Channel to London, Camille and Jean to follow separately. It was not a heroic departure. It was the exit of a man who had run out of other options. London received him without ceremony. He knew almost no one there. He had no reputation in England, no connections to the art world, and very little money. What he had was time, and the city itself, which turned out to be more than enough. London in 1870 was not the clean, photographed city of tourist imagination. It was a vast industrial organism, coal smoke thickening the air over the Thames, fog rolling in from the estuary and sitting for days over the bridges and the water. The light was nothing like Normandy. It was diffused and strange, filtered through layers of atmosphere that turned the river into something almost abstract. Monet, who had spent 15 years training himself to look at what light actually did rather than what he expected it to do, found himself looking at something he had never seen before. He visited the National Gallery and studied Turner. Consider what that encounter meant. Here was an English painter, dead nearly 20 years, who had spent his career dissolving form into atmosphere, who had painted the Thames as pure light and colour rather than as solid stone and water. Turner had arrived somewhere close to where Monet was heading, by a completely different route and under completely different circumstances. Monet was not a man who admitted influences easily. But Turner's late paintings, the ones that seemed to his contemporaries unfinished or incomprehensible, would take up permanent residence somewhere in Monet's thinking about what painting could do with a river and a fog. Then, in the winter of 1870, something happened that would prove more consequential than anything Turner had shown him. The painter Charles d'Aubigny, a landscape artist of the older generation, who'd been one of the few voices defending the young Impressionists to the Salon jury, was also in London. D'Aubigny introduced Monet to a French art dealer named Paul Durand-Ruel, who had opened a gallery on New Bond Street after fleeing the war himself. The introduction took perhaps a few minutes. Its effects lasted decades. Durand-Ruel was 39 years old in 1870. He had already committed himself to a position that his rivals thought was financial madness. He believed in painters the official art world rejected. He had bought Barbizon landscapes when they were considered provincial and rough. He recognised, with a kind of prophetic stubbornness, that the painters working against the Academy's rules were not failures, they were early. When he saw Monet's work, he bought it, not one or two pieces as a speculative gesture, but consistently, over years, at prices that gave Monet something he had almost never experienced, a degree of predictable income. This was not charity, and it was not simple commerce. Durand-Ruel was making a calculated argument with his money. He believed the market for this kind of painting existed, but that it had to be created, that audiences needed to be shown these works repeatedly, in quality exhibitions over time, before they would understand what they were looking at. He was right, but the timeline was longer and more expensive than even he had anticipated. Through the 1870s, he would buy paintings he could not always sell. He would spend his own capital supporting artists whose work sat unsold in his storerooms. There were moments in the late 1870s when his gallery came close to bankruptcy. He kept going anyway. Without him, it is genuinely difficult to say how the painters who would become the Impressionistes would have survived the decade between their first independent exhibition and the moment the public finally began to accept them. Monet understood this. He was not always grateful in his dealings with Duranruel. He was a difficult man in most of his professional relationships. But he understood what the dealer had done. Monet returned to France in late 1871, after the war had ended and the chaos of the Paris Commune had subsided. He settled at Argenteuil, a small town on the Seine, about 10 kilometers northwest of Paris. It was not where he would have chosen to live if choosing had been easy, but Argenteuil had a river. The river had light on it at every hour of the day, and that was what mattered. The years at Argenteuil from 1872 to 1878 are the years when Monet's mature style locks into place. The brushwork loosens further, the colour gets higher and more direct. He paints the Seine in summer and winter, the railway bridge, the sailboats, the regattas, the light in the reeds at the water's edge. He builds a small studio on a flat-bottomed boat, mooring it and floating it out into the current so he can work from the middle of the water. The man who had tried to drown himself in the Seine 4 years earlier was now painting from the surface of it. Watching the light move across the same water that had almost taken him. Argenteuil was not grand and it was not Paris, but it was where Monet finally found the conditions he needed. A river, changing light. Enough distance from everything that had almost killed him to actually work. The painting that named the movement was not Monet's best, and he probably knew it. By the winter of 1873, Monet and the painters who had gathered around him, Renoir, Pissarro, Degas, Berthe Morisot, Sisley, Cézanne, had accumulated enough rejections from the official salon to make a decision that had been building for years. The salon was the gatekeeper. It controlled what the French public saw, what dealers bought, what critics wrote about, what collectors considered worth owning. And it had made clear, repeatedly, and without apology, that what these painters were doing did not qualify as finished work. The brushwork was too loose. The subjects were too ordinary. The surfaces lacked the smooth mirror-like finish that academic tradition demanded. They had been told this so many times that some of them had started to wonder whether the problem was not their paintings, but the institution doing the judging. What they organised in response was not, at first, a rebellion. They called it the Société Anonyme des Artistes Peintres, Sculpteurs et Graveurs, a cooperative society, deliberately unglamorous in its title, structured to avoid the appearance of a manifesto. They did not want to declare war on the salon. They wanted, more practically, to show their work to the public without requiring the salon's permission. The distinction mattered to them. This was not a group that agreed on everything. Degas was contemptuous of painting outdoors. Cézanne was suspicious of almost everyone. What held them together was less a shared philosophy than a shared frustration. The practical understanding that they needed each other if they were going to mount an exhibition at all. The first exhibition of the Société Anonyme opened on April 15th, 1874, in the studios of the photographer Nadar on the Boulevard des Capucines. 30 artists contributed work. The public came. Some of them were curious, some were contemptuous, and a few were genuinely interested. The critics came too. Most of them left with their opinions already formed before they had looked carefully at anything. Monet contributed several works. Among them was a canvas he had painted 2 years earlier in Le Havre, a view of the harbour in the early morning. The water a deep blue-grey, a small orange sun reflected in broken strokes across the surface, rowboats barely visible in the haze. The industrial cranes and masts of the port are suggestions rather than descriptions. Nothing in the painting is finished in the academic sense. Everything in the painting is exactly as Monet intended it. He called it Impression Sunrise. A critic named Louis Leroy attended the exhibition and wrote a review for the satirical journal Le Charivari. His approach was theatrical contempt. He structured the review as a dialogue between himself and a fictional academic painter, moving through the galleries and reacting with escalating horror to what they saw. When he reached the Monet, the fictional academician demanded to know what the painting depicted. Leroy's answer was that it was an impression, nothing more, nothing less. From that exchange, he extracted the term that would define the movement. He called them the Impressionists, and he meant it as an insult. The word in his usage implied incompleteness, sloppiness, the arrogance of painters who mistook a first sketch for a finished artwork. What happened next was not planned. The painters, rather than arguing against the label, took it. Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and the others began using the word themselves, stripping it of its contemptuous intent and replacing that intent with something else entirely. They were Impressionists. This was not a concession. It was a redefinition. Consider what they were actually claiming. The academic tradition held that a painting was finished when its surface was smooth, its forms were clearly described. Its subject, preferably historical, mythological, or morally instructive, was rendered with the same faithful precision you might expect from a well-made map. An Impressionist painting violated all of those requirements simultaneously. The brushwork was visible, the forms were approximate, the subjects were harbours at dawn, riverbanks in afternoon light, women in gardens, railway stations full of smoke. But the painters were not admitting these were flaws. They were arguing that the academic definition of finished was wrong at its foundation. A painting that captured what it actually felt like to stand at the edge of Le Havre harbour on a grey morning in 1872, with the sun coming up through the mist and the water moving in small cold waves beneath you. That painting was more complete, more true than any smooth academic surface depicting an event that had never happened in a way no one had ever seen it. That was the argument. The critics were not ready to hear it, and the public was not ready to accept it. The reviews, with a few exceptions, were hostile. The exhibition drew visitors who came to laugh as much as to look. Sales were poor. When the Société Anonyme dissolved its accounts at the end of the exhibition, it had lost money. Several of the participating artists were worse off financially than they had been before April. Monet returned to Argenteuil. He still owed money. He still depended on Durand-Ruel's support. Durand-Ruel was himself under financial pressure from a banking crisis that had swept through France the previous year. The movement that had just been named was not, in any material sense, a success. It had a name, which was something. It had a group of painters who would continue working and exhibiting together, in different combinations and with different degrees of shared purpose, for the better part of the next decade. But the name had not translated into sales, and sales were what Monet needed to keep painting. What the exhibition of 1874 had done was establish a position. The Impressionists existed now as a recognised category, even if the recognition came wrapped in mockery. Collectors who were cautious in 1874 would sometimes become interested in 1878 or 1881 precisely because they had heard the name, remembered the controversy, started to look more carefully at what the work was actually doing. The contempt of the critics had created visibility, and visibility, over time, was worth something. 7 more Impressionist exhibitions would follow over the next 12 years. Monet participated in most of them, stopped participating, returned. Eventually went his own way as his career stabilised and his methods became even more his own. But April 1874 was the moment the group announced itself to the world. The world responded with ridicule. The critics had given them a name meant to humiliate. The painters had taken it and made it their own, which was not yet the same thing as success. Camille Monet died on the 5th of September 1879, and that morning her husband sat beside the bed and painted her. She was 32 years old. She'd been ill for months, deteriorating through the difficult pregnancy that had produced their second son, Michel, the previous year. The tuberculosis moved through her slowly, and then quickly, as it tends to. Monet had painted her face more than almost any other subject in his life, put her in green dresses, handed her parasols, stood her in bright summer fields, with her back to the viewer and the light falling across her shoulders. Now he was sitting beside her dying body with a brush in his hand. The painting he made that morning is called Camille Monet on her deathbed. It's almost entirely grey and pale blue and white. Her features are barely resolved from the surrounding bedclothes. It doesn't look like a portrait. It looks like something dissolving into the light around it. He described what happened afterward with something approaching horror. He wrote that he found himself almost involuntarily studying the colours crossing her face, the precise tones of pallor and shadow, the way morning light caught the hollows near her cheekbones, the specific quality of blue-white where the sheets met her skin. He couldn't stop himself. The eye that Boudin had trained on the harbour at Le Havre went on working, even here, even now, against his own grief. What does that reveal about a man? That the worst moment of his life arrived, and his first instinct was to look at it, to measure it in paint. Some read this as coldness, others read it as the only form of devotion he'd ever fully learned. Probably it was both. He wasn't a man who expressed himself easily in any language except paint, and in that language, he was doing everything he could. He was keeping her. The painting is small. You can walk past it in a museum in under 2 minutes. But it's one of the most unsettling portraits ever made, not because it idealizes its subject, but because it refuses absolutely to look away. The canvas itself seems almost to recoil from what it shows, and yet it does not turn away. She'd been part of his life since 1865. She'd posed for him when he had no money to pay a professional model. She'd lived through the worst of the poverty, the salon rejections, the seasons when there was genuinely not enough food. She stayed when other women wouldn't have. In 1868, Monet had attempted suicide in the Seine because he couldn't provide for her and their son, Jean. She stayed through that too. What they had between them wasn't easy. It had never been easy. To understand what these years meant, you also need to understand the Hochedés. Ernest Hochedé was a prosperous department store owner in Paris who'd been buying Impressionist paintings with genuine enthusiasm through the 1870s. He had taste, money, and real feeling for what Monet and the others were doing. In 1876, he invited Monet to work at the family chateau at Montgeron and commissioned decorative panels for its interiors. That was real support, the kind Monet always needed and too rarely received. But by 1877, Ernest's finances were collapsing. By 1878, he was bankrupt. The chateau went to auction. Ernest, his wife Alice, and their 6 children had nowhere stable to go. The Monets, no less precarious, took a rented house at Véteuil with them, a small village on the Seine, roughly 40 miles northwest of Paris. 8 children between 2 families. An erratic, increasingly absent Ernest, and Camille, already dying, in the room upstairs. Through 1878 and into 1879, Monet painted constantly. The household needed money, and he was its only reliable source. He painted the church at Véteuil at different hours, bright morning light, grey overcast afternoons, the pale half-darkness of November. He painted the river. He painted the ice beginning to form at its edges. The work was relentless. It was also good. He was developing, almost without recognizing it, the habit of returning to the same motif under changing conditions, the practice that would define the great series paintings of the following decade. This repetitive approach became almost meditative, a way of understanding light and atmosphere through accumulated observation rather than single moments of inspiration. Then September 5th. Then the winter. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was brutally cold. The Seine froze solid. When the January thaw came, the river broke apart in enormous slow-moving slabs, grey and white masses of ice grinding downstream. Monet went out and painted it. The series that resulted, known as the ice drift paintings or the debacle, is rendered in a palette almost entirely stripped of warmth. Grey water, white ice, pale washed sky, bare trees along the banks like dark notations against nothing. They're beautiful in the way certain grim things are beautiful, and they're among the most desolate work he ever produced. He'd just buried his wife. The river was breaking into pieces. He painted it 12 times, in freezing weather, standing on the bank. In these works, grief found its visual equivalent. Ernest Hocheday was by this point spending more and more time in Paris. He and Alice never formally separated, but the distance between them had widened into something past any practical definition of marriage. Alice stayed. She managed the household. She cared for the children, hers and Monet's both. Their relationship deepened the way it does when two people share grief, exhaustion, and the daily work of keeping something large from falling apart completely. By 1881, when Monet moved the combined household to Poissy, Alice went with him. When he moved again in 1883 to Giverny, she went again. Whatever had formed between them had become, without ceremony or announcement, the structure of both their lives. Monet was also ranging farther from home. Extended painting trips took him to the chalk cliffs at Étretat on the Normandy coast, then to the storm-battered headlands of Brittany, and south to Bordighera in northern Italy, where the Mediterranean light struck the olive groves and hillside villages with an intensity he hadn't encountered since Algeria. His colour was growing more saturated. His technique was pushing towards something harder to name than plain Impressionism. More sustained, more deliberate, concerned less with the capture of a single passing impression than with what accumulated over repeated visits to the same place in different light. Across the Atlantic, meanwhile, Paul Durand-Ruel was making real progress. If you want to understand how Monet's fortunes finally turned, you follow the money westward. His exhibitions of Impressionist work in New York and Boston in 1886 reached audiences who carried none of the institutional prejudice that had greeted the paintings in Paris. American collectors bought freely and without apology. The money came back across the ocean, and Monet's circumstances changed in ways that would have been almost unimaginable to the man who'd stood on the bank of the Seine in 1868 and chosen to fall in. The financial crisis that had shaped his entire adult life was finally, genuinely beginning to end. He would later say he was horrified at himself for noticing the way the light moved across her face. But he noticed it, and he painted it, and it is one of the most devastating things he ever made. The house at Giverny was nothing remarkable when Monet first rented it in 1883, a farmhouse in a small Norman village. Unremarkable except for a strip of orchard land and enough space to eventually build something extraordinary. He arrived with Alice Hocheday and their combined 8 children, his 2 sons and her 6, a household assembled from 2 broken families. Still technically irregular, since Ernest Hocheday was alive in Paris, and the marriage that would legitimize everything was nearly a decade away. What the move gave Monet was not respectability. It gave him ground, actual soil, a place he could shape the way he shaped a canvas, according to his own logic. His own sense of what colour and light and time could do when properly arranged. Giverny sat in the valley of the Seine, about 50 miles northwest of Paris, where the Epte River joined the larger water. The village had fewer than 300 inhabitants. The Norman light here was soft and changeable in the way Monet had understood since childhood. The same Atlantic weather systems that had shaped his eye in Le Havre still swept across this valley. Moving cloud shadows across the hillsides in the same patterns he had watched from the beach as a boy. He He had not stumbled onto Giverny accidentally. He had been searching for exactly this kind of light, in exactly this kind of place, for years. The property he rented from a local landowner included a house, several outbuildings, a long-walled garden that had been used for vegetables and fruit. Monet saw something in it that the previous occupants, evidently, had not. Within weeks of moving in, he had begun rearranging. The kitchen garden stayed, but the formal plantings that divided the rest of the space were torn out. What Monet wanted was not the tidy geometry of a French country garden. He wanted masses of colour, overlapping blooms in sequences that would carry from April through October, walls of nasturtiums and climbing roses, beds of irises and poppies organised less by botanical category than by the way colours played against each other in afternoon light. He was designing with the same eye he used on a canvas, asking which combinations would hold together at a distance, that would dissolve into each other at noon, that would glow when the sun dropped low in the west. Paul Durand-Ruel's American success in the mid-1880s was beginning to translate into real income. By 1890, Monet had enough money to stop renting. He purchased the Giverny property outright in November of that year. That meant he could finally commit to the longer transformations he'd been planning for 7 years. The purchase price was 30,000 francs. He paid it without hesitation. Ernest Rochedet had died in March 1891. Monet and Alice married the following year, in July of 1892. The household that had been improvised from catastrophe was now, finally, legal. Giverny was home in a way nowhere had been since his childhood in Le Havre. What followed was systematic in a way that surprised even people who knew how exacting he was about his painting. He hired gardeners, eventually 7 of them, and managed them with a precision that left nothing to individual judgment. His written instructions specified which varieties were to be planted where, at what depths, in what combinations. He collected botanical catalogues and horticultural manuals the way he had once collected painting supplies, annotating them, writing to nurseries across France and the Netherlands for bulbs and seeds. Visitors to Giverny sometimes found him more agitated about the garden than about anything on his easel. He was not wrong to be. The garden was the easel. The water garden came later, and it came harder. In 1893, Monet purchased a strip of additional land across a small road and a railway spur that ran along the property's southern edge. The land included a marshy area fed by a small branch of the Epte. His plan was to divert enough water to create a proper pond, large enough to support water lilies, spanned by a Japanese-style wooden bridge of the kind he had seen in the woodblock prints he had been collecting for years. The idea was not modest. It required redirecting a waterway, excavating a substantial basin, constructing infrastructure that would alter the hydrology of that corner of the valley. His neighbours were alarmed. Several of them filed formal objections with the local prefectural authority in the spring of 1893. They worried that exotic aquatic plants would contaminate the water they drew for their livestock and crops, that whatever Monet was doing would affect their irrigation. They were not entirely unreasonable in their concern. Monet's response was to write letters. He wrote to the sub-prefect of Les Andelys, explaining that the plants he intended to grow were ornamental water lilies and not some invasive foreign species, that the pond he was constructing would not meaningfully reduce the water available downstream, that he was a serious painter with a serious artistic purpose, and that the neighbours' anxieties were without foundation. He was polite. He was also very certain that he was going to get what he wanted. The permits came through. Construction began. By 1895, the pond existed in something close to its final form. The Japanese bridge arched over the water at the narrow end, draped eventually in wisteria. The water surface was thick with the broad round leaves of the lilies he had ordered from a specialist grower in La Tour-Marliac, a nursery in the southwest of France, whose propriété had spent decades developing hybrid varieties in colours far beyond the white of native European species. Pinks, deep crimsons, pale yellows, the particular soft violet that Monet would spend the rest of his life attempting to put accurately onto canvas. He had the pond dredged regularly to keep the water clear. He had the lily pads thinned when they grew too dense. He had the surface of the water cleaned each morning before he painted, so that the reflections would not be broken by debris. The pond was a controlled environment in the way a laboratory is controlled. Every variable he could manage, he managed. What was Monet actually doing in that garden? In those years when the pond was new and the wisteria was young and his sight was still reliable, he was building the conditions for a sustained act of looking. He had spent 30 years chasing light across Normandy, Brittany, the Mediterranean coast, the English Channel, the fog-bound Thames. He had set up easels on cliff edges, and in hired rooms and on a boat he had fitted out as a floating studio on the Seine. All of that restless movement had been in the service of finding the right light in the right place. At Giverny, he reversed the logic. He brought the light to him, or rather, he engineered a surface that would hold and transform light in precisely the ways that interested him most. Still water reflecting the sky, the play of cloud shadow across lily pads, the way depth and surface confused each other in the right conditions, so that you could not always tell what was solid and what was reflection, what was above the water and what was below. This was not incidental to his painting practice. It was his painting practice. He was not a man who painted in a garden. He was a man who built a garden to paint. The distinction matters. By the mid-1890s, the garden at Giverny was not a place where Monet went to find inspiration. It was a living instrument, as carefully constructed as any painting he had ever made. The haystacks were not interesting subjects. Monet himself admitted as much, and that was almost the point. By the late 1880s, the garden at Giverny was taking shape, but Monet's attention was pulling in a different direction entirely. He had been painting long enough, and failing long enough, to understand something that most painters never fully grasp. The subject was not the subject. What mattered was light. What mattered was the moment, the specific hour, the particular weight of the atmosphere on a given afternoon in October. He had known this since Boudin had taken him out onto the Norman beaches 30 years earlier, but he had never yet found a systematic way to prove it. The haystacks gave him that. They were ordinary grain stacks, the kind scattered across every Norman farm field in autumn, built up after the harvest and left to stand through the winter. There was nothing romantic about them. No mythology, no history, no sentiment. They were agricultural equipment, more or less. And Monet began painting them in earnest in 1890, returning to the same fields near Giverny day after day, with a wheelbarrow full of canvases, and increasingly an assistant to carry them. The method was precise. He would begin a canvas in the morning light, work until the light shifted, sometimes within an hour, then move to a second canvas that better matched the new conditions, then a third. Sometimes he worked 5 or 6 canvases in a single day, cycling through them as the light cycled through its chai. Yes, the haystacks barely moved, the light never stopped. What he was building was not a collection of paintings about haystacks. He was building an argument. Consider what the series actually claims, taken together. In one canvas, the same stack glows orange-gold in the low winter sun, casting a long blue shadow across snow. In another, painted from almost the same position, the stack dissolves into summer haze, its edges softened by heat, its colour shifted into warm ochre and rose. In a third, morning mist turns the whole field into grey and violet. The stack has not changed. The season has changed. The hour has changed. The light has changed. And the painting has changed entirely. Monet's argument was that all of these paintings were equally true, or more precisely, that none of them was more true than the others. There was no correct version of the haystack. There was only the light that happened to fall on it at the moment you were standing in front of it, and if you blinked, that light was already gone. This was a radical claim, though it was delivered quietly, through paint rather than manifestos. Academic painting had always assumed that the painter's job was to find and render the essential form of a thing, its true and stable appearance. The conventions of studio painting existed precisely to impose stability, to remove the variables of weather and time and atmosphere so that the painter could work toward a definitive image. Monet was saying, in effect, that the variables were the painting. Stability was a fiction. What you saw depended entirely on when you were looking. He finished the series in his studio, reworking the canvases through the winter of 1890 into 1891. In May of 1891, Paul Durand-Ruel exhibited 15 of them together at his Paris gallery. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every canvas sold within days. Critics who had spent years dismissing Monet's work as unfinished, as hasty, as lacking seriousness, reversed themselves almost in unison. The poet and critic Gustave Geoffroy wrote that standing in the gallery felt like watching time itself become visible. Pissarro saw the exhibition and wrote to his son that he was moved to tears. The prices Monet commanded for the haystacks were unlike anything he had received before. The financial insecurity that had shadowed his entire adult life, the poverty of the 1860s, the desperate loans, the years of painting magnificent canvases he could not sell, effectively ended that spring. He was 50 years old. He did not pause to enjoy it for long. Within months of the Haystacks exhibition, he was already planning the next series. The Poplars followed almost immediately, running through 1891 and into 1892. Where the haystacks were squat and horizontal, embedded in the fields, the poplars were vertical. A row of trees along the bank of the Epte River near Giverny, their trunks rising straight and their canopies swaying. Monet rented a boat to paint from, anchoring it in the river so he could look along the row of trees as they receded into the distance. He had barely begun when he learned that the trees were scheduled to be auctioned and cut. He paid a local timber merchant to delay the cutting until he had finished painting them. He needed the trees more than the merchant needed the wood, and he had money now. The poplars were formally different from the haystacks, more linear, more architectural, but the underlying method was identical. Same trees, different light. Early morning, when the reflections in the water were still and clear. Midday, when the shadows shortened and the colour flattened. Autumn, when the leaves had turned. The series was exhibited in 1892 and sold just as quickly. What the series method was revealing went beyond painting. It was revealing something about the nature of looking itself. Every time you return to the same scene, you are not seeing the same scene. The light is different, which means the colour is different, which means your perception of the forms and distances is different. Memory, when it tells you what something looks like, is lying to you, or rather, it is averaging across all the times you've seen it, collapsing 1,000 different instants into a single, false stable image. Monet's series refused that collapse. Each canvas held one moment, insisting on its particularity, insisting that this moment was irreducibly different from all the others. Taken together, the canvases did not add up to a comprehensive portrait of the subject. They added up to a portrait of time. This is the point at which Monet's art begins to outrun the category of Impressionism. The Impressionists had argued for the validity of the immediate sensation, the sketch-like response to direct experience. Monet had believed that too, and had painted that way for 20 years. But the series paintings were something more deliberate than spontaneous response. They were systematic, almost scientific. They were organised not around feeling but around a hypothesis about the nature of perception. Monet had not stopped being an impressionist in any simple sense, but he had moved somewhere the original movement had not anticipated, somewhere that would take another generation of painters and critics years to adequately describe. He had proved that the subject barely mattered, and the light was everything, and the proof had sold out in days and made him, at last, genuinely wealthy. In the winter of 1892, Monet rented a room above a fabric shop, directly facing the western facade of Rouen Cathedral, set up his canvases, spent 2 winters doing something that looked, from the outside, like obsession. He worked with more than 20 canvases propped around him at once. As the light shifted, as morning grey gave way to midday gold, and midday gold contracted into the violet cold of late afternoon, he moved from one canvas to the next, tracking the changes with the same systematic patience he had applied to the haystacks. The stone of the cathedral was his subject in the way that the stone of the haystacks had never truly been his subject. What he was actually painting was light. The cathedral was simply the surface it landed on. And that distinction, which sounds like a fine philosophical point, was in practice the most radical claim any painter had made about what a painting was supposed to do. Consider what the Rouen series actually argued. The same facade, the same carved Gothic portal, the same towers appeared in painting after painting as entirely different objects. In morning mist, the stone is silver and weightless, dissolving at its edges into pale atmosphere. In full afternoon sun it turns gold, almost molten, so warm and dense it seems to press forward out of the canvas. At dusk it goes violet and blue, cool and ancient, the carved saints and garlands retreating into shadow. Which of these was the cathedral's real colour? Monet's answer was that the question was wrong. There was no real colour. There was only the colour that existed at a specific hour, under specific conditions of atmosphere and sky. What we call the appearance of a thing is merely the most familiar version of its appearance. Every other version is equally true. He returned the following winter to refine the canvases. He had started them outdoors, in that rented room, moving constantly, keeping pace with the light. Then he brought them back to Giverny and reworked them. This was already a change. The haystacks had been completed more directly, in closer proximity to the original observation. The cathedral paintings were more mediated, more processed, the first signs that the boundary between direct observation and remembered experience was beginning to shift in his practice. When the Rouen Cathedral series was exhibited in Paris in 1895, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 20 canvases from the series went on display at Durand-Ruel's gallery. Critics and painters came to look with something close to disbelief. Paul Cézanne, who was not a man inclined toward generous assessments of his contemporaries, reportedly said that Monet was only an eye, but my God, what an eye! It was meant as both compliment and reservation. Cézanne believed that painting needed structure, permanence, something beneath the shimmer. But even he could not look at the cathedral series and pretend it was merely clever. Something true was happening there. The paintings had found a way to represent the act of seeing rather than the result of it. That was genuinely new. The London series came next and it pushed further still. Monet made 3 extended trips to London, in 1899, in 1900. Again in 1901, painting from a window at St Thomas Hospital on the south bank of the Thames. The view across the river gave him Waterloo Bridge, Charing Cross Bridge, the Houses of Parliament rising from the fog. London in those years was a city perpetually wrapped in coal smoke and river mist, the light filtering through industrial haze into something pale and strange, neither grey nor yellow, but both at once. It was, for a painter of atmosphere, almost absurdly perfect. He set up his canvases the way he always did, multiple in progress at once, moving between them as conditions changed. But London's fog was different from Norman light. It moved unpredictably. It thickened and thinned without warning. Some mornings the Houses of Parliament were barely visible, great Gothic shapes barely distinguishable from the atmosphere surrounding them. Other mornings the fog lifted enough to show the stonework, then closed again within the hour. Monet chased these conditions with the same relentless patience he had brought to the haystacks and the cathedral. What was different, and this matters, is what happened afterward. The London paintings were not finished in London, Monet brought the canvases back to Giverny, and he completed them there in his studio from memory. This was not how he had worked before. The entire foundation of his art, the thing Boudin had drilled into him on the beaches of Normandy 40 years earlier, was that the painter must stand before the motif while the light is actually happening. To finish a painting from memory was to admit that memory had become part of the process, that the image inside his mind accumulated across 3 winters of looking at the Thames in fog was itself a legitimate source. He was not abandoning observation. He was extending it backward into recollection, trusting that what he remembered about the light was true in some essential way, even if it was no longer precise. The London paintings were exhibited in 1904, 37 canvases at Durand-Ruel's gallery. Critics praised them. The fog of the Thames had become, under Monet's hand, something almost architectural. The bridges and the Parliament looming through it like objects seen in a dream that was nonetheless entirely specific. The yellow-grey industrial light of London had been transformed into something rich and strange, and no one looking at those paintings could locate exactly where the observed ended and the remembered began. What began with Boudin insisting that painting must happen in front of the motif had arrived 30 years later. At a painter finishing canvases in his studio by memory, and both positions somehow were true to the same underlying vision. Alice Hochadet died in May 1911, and afterward the house at Giverny, which had always been full of children and noise, and the argument of a large blended family, went quiet in a way it had never been before. Monet was 70 years old. He had shared his life with Alice for more than 30 years, through poverty, through the long, complicated arrangements before their marriage, through the building of the garden, through every major canvas he had made since Camille's death. She had managed the household, the children, the finances, the endless practical demands that Monet himself had no patience for. Without her, the structure that had allowed him to paint collapsed. He stopped working almost entirely. Letters from this period describe a man who could barely bring himself to enter the studio. Visitors noted that he seemed diminished, slower, less certain of everything. The garden continued to grow, tended by the same gardeners he had always employed, but Monet had little interest in it. The grief was not the only thing closing in on him. By the time Alice died, Monet had been noticing changes in his vision for several years. Colours were shifting. Contours that should have been sharp were blurring at the edges. He had said nothing publicly, dismissed the changes in private as tiredness or bad light, but the deterioration was real, and it was progressing. The cataracts that had been forming quietly were beginning to interfere with the one faculty that had defined his entire life. Consider what that meant for a man who had spent 5 decades training his eye to perceive what no one else could perceive. The instrument he had built his entire existence around was failing. Then in 1914, his son Jean died. Jean was 47. He had married Alice's daughter Blanche, and for years the two of them had lived close to Giverny, part of the extended family that surrounded Monet. Jean's death came after a long illness, and it arrived when Monet was already fragile. He had buried a wife. Now he buried a son. Blanche, widowed herself, moved into the house at Giverny and stayed. She managed the household, looked after her father-in-law, and quietly took on the role that Alice had once filled. Monet worked when he could. Blanche made that possible. The First World War had begun that same summer. The front lines were not far. Monet could hear, on certain days, the distant sound of artillery carrying across the countryside. Most of Giverny's younger residents had left to serve. His son Michel was somewhere in the fighting. Friends urged Monet to evacuate. He refused. He was not, at 74, going to abandon the garden he had spent 30 years building. He stayed and he painted, though painting had become something far more difficult than it had ever been before. By 1915, his vision had deteriorated badly enough that he could no longer trust what he saw. He knew what the colours were supposed to be. He knew, intellectually, that the blues in the water should read as blues. But the cataracts were filtering everything through a yellow-brown haze, compressing the distinctions between tones that he had once perceived with extraordinary precision. He began to rely increasingly on the labels of his paint tubes, on habit, on memory. Some canvases from this period carry a muddy warmth that is the visual record of a man painting partially blind. What did he do about it? For years, very little. The operation existed. Surgeons had told him it could restore his sight. He understood the mechanics, but he was terrified. He was an elderly man in uncertain health, and surgical anesthesia in the early 20th century carried genuine risk. He had watched enough people die on tables that he did not trust the procedure. More than that, he was terrified of what the operation might do to his perception, even if it succeeded. He had heard of patients emerging from cataract surgery with drastically altered colour vision. For most people, that would be manageable. For Monet, it was an existential threat. The colours he saw were the only material he had. He resisted for years. By 1922, he could barely see well enough to evaluate what was on a canvas in front of him. He was still working on the great Water Lily panels he had committed to donating to the French state, the enormous decorative cycle that would eventually fill the orangery. The panels were essential. He could not finish them blind. In January 1923, at the age of 82, he finally agreed to the operation. The surgery was performed on his right eye. It went as well as such operations went. His sight improved substantially, but the corrective lenses the surgeons gave him distorted his colour perception in a new and different way, rendering everything with an overwhelming yellow cast. He was horrified. He had traded one distortion for another. The canvases he painted in the immediate aftermath of the operation carry an unusual red-orange warmth that he himself disliked intensely. After adjustments were made to his lenses, he went back and repainted sections, trying to correct what the early post-surgical period had done to his work. He was 83 years old, repainting canvases by inadequate light, trying to recover something he was not certain he had ever fully regained. There is something almost unreasonable about the determination this required. His wife was dead. His son was dead. A world war had been fought and won within sight of his garden. His eyes, those extraordinary instruments he had spent a lifetime refining, had betrayed him. He had been through a surgery that frightened him deeply and had emerged from it still uncertain whether he could see what he needed to see. And he kept working. The panels had to be finished. He had promised them to France. The promise and the work and the pond outside the studio window, these were what remained, and he held to them. He could barely see the canvases he was working on. He was nearly 80 years old. His wife and his son were both dead, and he refused to stop. By 1914, Monet had been painting the Water Lily pond at Giverny for 15 years. He had not finished, had not come close to finishing, what the pond was making him understand. The pond was small. That is the first thing worth saying about it. The water surface Monet had been studying since the late 1890s measured perhaps 100 feet across at its widest point, a shallow artificial basin fed by a diverted tributary of the Epte River, fringed with weeping willows and crossed by the low arc of a Japanese-style bridge. He had designed it himself, negotiated with local officials to build it, fought neighbours who worried about the water diversion, planted the water lilies with the same obsessive precision he brought to the rest of the Giverny garden. He had made it, in other words. Then he had spent decades trying to understand what he had made. By 1914, the pond had generated hundreds of canvases. It had not been exhausted. It could not be exhausted because the Payot and was never the same pond twice. What changed after 1914 was scale. Monet was 73 years old. Alice was dead. His son Jean was dying. The German armies were moving through France. The sound of artillery could be heard from Giverny on still days. A lesser man might have stopped painting. Monet built a new studio instead. The building, completed in 1916, was enormous, high-ceilinged, skylit, large enough to accommodate canvases of a size he had never attempted before. He had conceived a project that went far beyond anything the series paintings had proposed. Not a sequence of individual panels to be hung on a gallery wall, a room, an environment, a space in which the viewer would be completely surrounded by water and light and reflection, with no horizon visible, no sky, no clear sense of where the surface ended and the depth began, just the perpetual shifting surface of the pond, rendered at a scale that made it feel not like a painting you were looking at, but like a place you were standing inside. The Grandes Décorations, as the project came to be called, would eventually comprise 18 panels. Some measured nearly 14 feet in height. The total length of the canvases, installed end to end, ran to more than 300 feet. No single painting in the history of Western art had attempted anything quite like it. The proposal to donate the work to the French state emerged in 1918. The timing was not coincidental. The war had just ended. France had survived something that had nearly destroyed it. Monet, who was old enough to remember the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, who had watched young men die within earshot of his garden for 4 years, wanted to give something back. The gesture was partly patriotic and partly personal. He was 80 years old. The panels were not finished, but the impulse to offer them, to make them public rather than private, represented a shift in how he understood what he was making. Georges Clemenceau brokered the arrangement. Clemenceau was then France's wartime prime minister, one of the architects of the Allied victory. He was also one of Monet's oldest friends. The two men had known each other for decades. Clemenceau would later write about Monet with a warmth and precision that few art critics have matched. He understood, perhaps better than any politician had reason to, what the panels represented. He pushed the French state to accept the gift, helped select the location, the Orangerie, a long low building in the Tuileries garden, and oversaw the construction of the 2 oval rooms that Monet himself had specified. The rooms were designed to receive natural light from above. The panels would be installed at eye level, curving around the walls so that a visitor entering either room would be surrounded on all sides by water. Monet never saw them installed. He died in December 1926. The Orangerie rooms opened in May 1927, 6 months later. But between the initial proposal in 1918 and his death, Monet spent 8 years in that enormous studio, working and reworking and in many cases destroying what he had made. His eyesight, which had been deteriorating for years, made the work agonizing. He operated partly by memory, partly by the labels he had begun attaching to his tubes of paint, so he could identify colours he could no longer clearly distinguish by looking at them. Some canvases he slashed with a knife when he judged them failures. Others he repainted so many times that the surface became a layered record of doubt and revision, each iteration sitting beneath the next like geological strata. Clemenceau, who visited regularly, had to talk him out of abandoning the project more than once. Monet's perfectionism, which had all his been severe, became something close to torment in these final years. He was trying to paint something he could barely see. He knew it, and he kept going anyway. What was he trying to paint? Consider what the pond had become to him by this point. He had been watching the same water surface for more than 30 years. He had seen it in morning mist and afternoon glare, in the flat grey light of overcast November days and the low gold of late autumn afternoons. He had watched the lily pads shift with the current, watched the willows trail their reflections across the surface, watched the light change so many thousands of times that the changes had become a kind of grammar he no longer needed to consciously translate. The late panels are not, in any ordinary sense, pictures of water lilies. They are records of perception itself, what it feels like to look at a surface you have looked at for decades. When looking has become so habitual that the boundary between the thing seen and the act of seeing has dissolved. The horizon is gone. The sky appears only as a reflection. There is no firm ground anywhere in the image. The viewer floats, surrounded by colour and light, without the usual anchors of perspective and spatial logic. This was not accident or the product of failing vision. It was the destination of a journey that had begun on a beach in Normandy in the 1850s, when a painter named Boudin had told a teenage caricaturist that light was the real subject, and the only way to paint it was to stand in front of it while it was moving. Monet had spent 70 years following that idea to its conclusion. The conclusion was the orangerie. The rooms opened without him. Clemenceau attended. The critical response was, initially, uncertain. The scale was too great, the imagery too abstract, the absence of conventional pictorial structure too disorienting for audiences accustomed to impressionist paintings of a more familiar kind. It would take decades for the full significance of what Monet had made to be understood. But the panels waited patiently in their oval rooms, which is what paintings do. He spent his last years inside the largest canvas he had ever attempted, surrounded by reflections, trying to paint not just what he saw, but the act of seeing itself, which was, when you look at the whole of his life, exactly where he had always been headed. Claude Monet died on the 5th of December, 1926, in the house at Giverny. Georges Clemenceau, who had governed France through the worst war in its history, was there at the end. The funeral was small. Monet had spent the last years of his life in increasing isolation. The ceremony reflected that, a private gathering, no public procession, no state occasion. Clemenceau reportedly refused to allow black at the service. Monet would not have wanted it. He was buried in the churchyard of the village church at Giverny, alongside Alice and other members of the household that had gathered around him over 40 years of life in that village. 6 months later, the orangerie opened. The 18 panels Monet had spent the last decade of his life completing were installed in 2 oval rooms in the Tuileries garden in Paris, exactly as he and Clemenceau had conceived them. A total environment. No horizon, no sky, the viewer surrounded on all sides by water and reflection and light. Monet never saw them installed. He had worried for years that he would not live to finish them. He was right, in a narrow sense. He finished them, but he did not see them hung. The rooms opened on May 17, 1927. The work that had consumed and nearly destroyed him in its final years now existed exactly as he had imagined it should. His reputation at the moment of his death was already extraordinary. He had been famous for decades. Major museums held his work. Collectors across Europe and America competed for his canvases. But fame in 1926 is not what fame became. The full scale of what Monet had done would take another generation to absorb. The absorption happened in an unexpected place, through an unexpected set of artists who saw in his late work something he may not have entirely intended. After the Second World War, American painters working in New York were wrestling with questions that had no obvious answers. How do you make a painting that does not merely represent something? How do you fill a canvas with feeling rather than description? How do you use scale and colour and surface to produce an experience rather than an image? Several of them found their way to the orangerie. Mark Rothko stood in those oval rooms. So did others working in what would become known as abstract expressionism. Clement Greenberg, the most influential American art critic of the post-war period, wrote about Monet's late panels with genuine urgency, arguing that they anticipated what the New York painters were discovering. The Water Lily paintings, made by an old man who could barely see in a garden in rural Normandy, turned out to be the bridge between 19th century Impressionism and the most radical painting of the 20th century. How does that happen? How does a painter who spent his career insisting on direct observation of the natural world end up as a founding figure of abstract art? The answer has something to do with what Monet was actually doing all along. He was not painting haystacks or cathedrals or water lilies. He was painting the act of seeing them. The subject was never the object. The subject was always the light, and the eye and the moment of encounter between them. By the time he was working on the Grandes Décorations in his late 70s and 80s, the pond's surface had become so familiar to him that what he was painting was closer to the interior experience of looking than to any external fact. The Rothkos and the de Koonings were doing something related. They just arrived there from a different direction. By the end of the 20th century, Monet exhibitions were drawing crowds that would have seemed implausible for any single artist. A 1988 exhibition of his work in Chicago drew record attendance. His paintings had become among the most recognized images in the world, printed on calendars, reproduced on walls, used to sell everything from coffee to insurance. This is the other side of his afterlife, the one that is harder to write about without some discomfort, and the very accessibility that made his work beloved also made it easy to mistake for decoration. The water lilies became wallpaper. People who had never stood in the orangerie thought they understood what the paintings were. What they understood was the reproduction. The painting itself is something different. The house at Giverny still stands. The garden is maintained with meticulous care, replanted each season according to Monet's original designs, the colours and arrangements documented and preserved. The Japanese bridge arches over the pond. The wisteria still grows across it. Every spring, the garden opens to visitors. The numbers are extraordinary, hundreds of thousands of people each year making their way to a small village in Upper Normandy to stand in the spaces where Monet worked for more than 4 decades. They come from every country. Many of them come more than once. What draws them is not simply the paintings, because the paintings are in museums. What draws them is something harder to name. Giverny is one of the few places in the world where you can stand in the same light that produced great art and understand, physically, why that light mattered. The pond is not large. Standing at its edge, you can see exactly the angle at which the willows trail into the water. The way the sky's reflection breaks across the lily pads, the way the surface changes from minute to minute as clouds move and the sun shifts. You can understand what Monet spent 30 years looking at. You can see why he did not run out of reasons to keep painting it. He had stood in front of the same water for decades, not because he lacked imagination, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because the thing he was trying to understand about light and time and seeing kept moving away from him as he approached it. Every morning the pond was different. Every morning required a new canvas. After 86 years, after poverty and rejection and suicide attempts and the loss of his sight and the deaths of everyone he loved, he was still there, still looking, still finding that it had not been exhausted. The pond is still there. The light still moves across it the way it always did. Somewhere in the oval rooms of the orangerie, those enormous panels still surround you with water and reflection, and the lifelong evidence that one man spent 70 years learning to see.